Azmat Khan, let me just start by asking you, there's so much to talk to you about, but let me just start by asking you first about your responses to the Biden speech, because I know you've been amongst the many voices who've been pointing out the huge crisis that a number of those who worked with America, its allies in Afghanistan, who've been left behind, and then you hear Joe Biden almost suggesting that it's kind of their fault.
Right. So a fundamental problem with what President Biden said was that he framed his speech around the decision to end the war, not around the hasty and chaotic exit that has left so many people who partnered themselves with the Americans in limbo. Another flaw was the fact that he did blame the Afghan government for many of these problems. And while it may be fair to critique certain politicians and political leaders, the reality is that Afghan national security forces have suffered immense human losses throughout this war. Now, they, while suffering those losses, were getting U.S. air support. So massive bombings accompanied these soldiers on the ground to help protect them. And even then, they were dying at high rates. So now, imagine that you take that air power out of the equation. The only thing that was really keeping this very tenuous government intact. You take away that air power and you expect forces to keep fighting when they were already losing so many lives with the support of American air power. It just doesn't add up to blame the Afghan government. At the same time, that air power was also having massive civilian tolls in battlefield provinces, lending support to the Taliban, and even among civilians just wanting them to strike whatever deal to make the war stop. So it doesn't really add up to blame Afghan national security forces in this situation.
I actually want to pull up your tweets about what you just said, because you put out a series of tweets which in a sense address that question about why the Afghan army and in that sense even the general populace just seemed to cave in and allowed the easy advance of the Taliban. Which, as you said, is linked to the fact that so much of the American bombing actually hit Afghan civilian population, particularly rural populations, very hard.
Yes. Nearly 3/4 of Afghanistan's population is in the rural countryside, in these rural areas. Now, they have been decimated by bombing. Even though the world's attention has turned away from the bombing that has been happening in Afghanistan, in 2019, the United States dropped more bombs in the country than in any previous year of this now 20-year-long war. So they were heavily bombing the countryside. And the intelligence, as we now know from the lack of intelligence in the lead up to the Taliban's takeover, was quite poor. So tons of civilians were dying. In families that I've spoken to, they've lost anywhere between 4 to 12 to 18 members in single incidents. And it's not just bombings, it's night raids by US-backed forces. It's also the Taliban, right? They're getting these kinds of attacks from all sides, and it's left people war-weary. We tend to, when we talk about Afghan women and girls, understandably, we're thinking about the tolls on women and girls in Kabul who are now going to get left behind, whose promises will be broken. But we don't necessarily talk as much about women and girls in the Afghan countryside, women and girls who just want to live a life free of war, not have their children die in their arms. You know, babies suffer disproportionate losses in bombings. Their bodies are smaller. They die more easily. And so imagine all of the mothers who've had to bury their children, women whom we never get to hear from.